keep your audio on. Would you please keep your audio on mute unless you're talking? And we are monitoring the chat. You can ask questions, make comments there at any time also. Today we have Kevin Allison, the Urban Soil Health Specialist with Marion County, Indiana, SWCD. And he's going to talk about cover crops and how to terminate them in your small farm or garden. We'll have plenty of time for questions and comments, so feel free to leave us messages. Let's start with Kevin. Are you there?
Yeah, thank you. Thank you. All right, welcome everyone. I'm going to share my screen real quick. I'm actually going to turn my video off. It was lagging a little bit, so hopefully that won't be a big issue. But please, please let me know if it's getting out of hand. Can you see that okay?
Yeah, it's looking good. I can see the coffee and cover.
All right, cool. Yeah, so my name's Kevin Allison. I'm with the Marion County Soil and Water Conservation District. The work that I do with soil health in small farms and gardens is supported by the USDA and RCS. So thank you for their support as well. So let's just dive right in and take a look at terminating cover crops. So I guess I wanted to set the context and just remember that the reason we use cover crops, well, there's lots of reasons too, but a great reason is just to boost soil life. So when I'm gardening, I'm always thinking about these 4 soil health principles. So anytime I'm terminating cover crop or planting vegetables or planting the garden, I'm trying to think about these 4 principles and how to integrate them. So maximize continuous living roots, minimize disturbance, maximize soil cover, and maximize biodiversity. And all that, like the plant roots, the cover crop roots, they're just the mulches that we use, they're food. For the soil life, we want to regulate and maintain good moisture, which is done by increasing and having good organic matter. Same thing with air and airflow even in the soil, and then trying to minimize disturbance to the soil as much as possible, so we can let those microorganisms build their shelter, build their ecosystem, build their home in the soil. So with that in mind, let's talk about cover crops. So that's what the garden that's what my demonstration plot looks like in, I think that's probably March of last year. So March or early April. So on bed A1, I've got my bed set up in a 30-inch bed system with walkways in between. So A1 was a winter-killed cover crop that died. A2 is kind of an experiment. So it's a mix of a cereal rye cover crop, but you can see it's overwintered. And then under it, there's some dead cover crop. A3 is a mixture of legumes, so they're providing nitrogen to the soil. And then A4 and A5 is what I would call a high biomass mix. It's got cereal rye and all sorts of legumes in it, and those are overwintering too. So you can see A1 died, and then the rest lived. And we'll go into more detail about this throughout the presentation. You can see very back, plot C, way back on the end, is fully tarped. That was an oats cover crop that actually died in the wintertime, and it's got a tarp on it to kind of seal the deal on weed suppression, and then that would be pulled off and planted. So eventually got to kill these cover crops, and this is what it might look like a few weeks later. So planted spinach and a dead cover crop in the foreground that was raked off, and then in the bed behind it, it was more of a high biomass mix that was killed and then transplanted into. So kind of a high level view of different cover crop termination methods. There's winter kill, so some will freeze and die. You can mow and cut some of them. You can crimp, which is basically breaking the stem every 6 inches. That's what they do in big agriculture with these big roller crimpers. For me, crimping is just pressing it down with my foot and making one crack at the bottom of the base of a plant. Tarping, which is putting a big black tarp over it and blocking out the sun, and then mulching to help kill a cover crop. Now, just throwing mulch on a cover crop is not going to kill it, so we'll go into detail about what all these 5 things look like actually in the field. So just still in high level overview, but freeze, there's some that winter kill and some that overwinter, and I'll show you some tools to figure out which ones do that and which ones don't. You can mow or cut them. It's usually most effective on the legumes and most effective at flowering stage. So they're putting all their energy into like almost ready to push out seed. I don't let them go to seed if I can, but if you, when they're at that flowering stage, they're easier to mow to kill. If you do it earlier, they'll have the tendency to want to regrow. Crimping, like I mentioned, is kind of like cracking that bottom part of the grass. That's actually cereal rye. Crimping's not super effective, at least with my feet, on something like a legume, like hairy vetch or crimson clover, but it does crack these grasses like cereal rye. And that's also most effective at flowering or anthesis stage. So when it's tall like this, if it's shorter, it's going to be a little bit harder to crimp. And I think I've got some examples of that too. All right, so tarping, that's another measure to kill them. So I like to combine this with the two previous ones. So I'm either usually crimping or cutting a cover crop and then putting a tarp on it. And that's 3 to 4 weeks in the spring. Probably more like 4 for something like cereal rye, but kind of depending on weather and the vigor of that crop. But usually 3 to 4 weeks will kill it. So you can see the picture on the right. There's been a cover crop that's been cut down, and one row was tarped and one row wasn't. The weed pressure on the left, like cutting down a cover crop at like the exact right time, might get you like 90-95% weed pressure, or like weed pressure. But that 5% still a lot of weeds, right? In a big bed like that, it's hard to kind of pick them out. So putting the tarp on really seals the deal on killing the cover crop. In the summertime, it can be a little less, maybe like even 10 days, depending on the crop. But usually in the spring, it's like 3 to 4 weeks. I don't have much examples of solarization. So occultation is tarping. It's just taking the light away from the veg, like taking photosynthesis away from the cover crop and killing it. Solarization would be using like a clear plastic, and that's pretty effective. I've not tried it, but I've read books and I've listened to other farmers talk about how they do it. And it's basically putting, when it's sunny out, putting a or a clear plastic over the cover crop and just solarizing it. So just heating it up to kill the vegetation. And there is some caution I take with that. If it's super hot and you leave it on for even sometimes 2 days or 5 days, depending on how hot it is, it can start really killing soil life. So just be cognizant of what the soil health is doing under that cover crop when you're solarizing. Just be checking it, I guess. So just a couple of pictures of tarps to kind of show how those are used in vegetable systems. That's some like regrowth of some beet leaves on the left, tarp for a few weeks, and then on the right you pull it off and a lot of it's decomposed. A couple more pictures of tarps out in big field. I guess I would, since we're talking about termination, like make sure if you are doing tarping, make sure you cut the tarps like longer or wider than your actual beds, right? Like I like to have them cover at least the walkways too. Like sometimes I've got tarps that are cut for a couple beds, but always make sure the length is longer than the bed, just because if it's shorter, you're going to have weed growth on the end or cover crop regrowth on the ends or on the edges. So it's just good to take the time to cut the tarp right and get a full coverage and a full kill. Mulching. So again, mulching doesn't just kill a cover crop, but it is a good supplement to killing a cover crop. So you might like cut something, like if you mow it flower and then put straw on top of it, it's going to help keep that regrowth down or any weeds down. But I like to kind of put this in combination with the tarp as well. So I might mulch and then tarp and then pull out the tarp and plant. So I think I've got some more examples of that as well. So yeah, and there's an example of kind of a cut cover crop, and he's mulching the walkways, right? But you could easily do that same tactic on top of that dead cover crop, and then maybe even tarp it if you think there's weeds are going to come back. Right. So tools. Hope we're on the same slide. Hope we're seeing the same thing. But this is just a quick tool list. It's not much to do. Doesn't take much to do these tactics really. So cover crop tables, which tell you, which ones die in the winter, which ones don't. A good crop plan, freezing temperatures if you're using winter-killed cover crop, a cutting tool, mulch, compost, tarp and sandbags to hold down the tarp, or it could be rocks or T-post. But make sure you get a good seal, or make sure you hold them down when the wind comes, and then resources and support. Okay, so tables. On the Marion SWCD.org website under soil health guide, if you scroll down to cover crops, there's a couple tables that are available. This one has the cover crops, and I just want you to pay attention to the middle column, which says winter survival. If it's expected, just expect it to overwinter. If it says never, expect it to die. So that's just a good chart to know which ones are winter killed and which ones are going to overwinter. So you can kind of see like oats and radish and field peas are common ones that rarely survive the winter. I'm not going to go into tillage, but if you are trying to kill a cover crop with tillage, you can go to Sayre Managing Cover Crops Profitably, the 3rd edition, and they have a table that talks about how easy it is to till kill or not till kill. And sometimes I think some of these tables are written for people with an actual big tiller, like maybe not just like a pitchfork. So sometimes if you do terminate a cover crop with like something like a pitchfork by turning it over, it might want to regrow a little bit. So it might take a couple passes. But I won't dwell on tillage for right now. But if you got questions about that, feel free in the Q&A. So yeah, this is another chart that shows which ones like die by freeze, which ones can more easily be mowed or cut, or which ones can more easily be crimped or tarped. Everything can be tarped, and I think that's kind of the beauty of it. I don't like using lots of plastic, but it is a good tool to kill these things. Crimping, it's usually the grasses. Mowing or cutting, it's usually the legumes. Freeze, it's kind of random, but there's like oats and radish and field peas. So just to look at like a calendar. So when you do plant like oats, radish and field peas or something that winter kills, it's going to be dead in January and February. If you plant something like cereal rye, that plant's going to live over the winter time. Same with crimson clover and hairy vetch are legumes. And then they're going to start blooming in like April and May and June, which is the right time to be cutting them or crimping them for a full kill. And I think that's where the tarp comes in handy, because I like to be planting my vegetables in May. So I want these cover crops dead. So I'm usually tarping in, let's say, like April. So I hope you can see the spring crop plan on this on your screens right now. I know it was lagging a little bit earlier, so it might be about 10 seconds behind. I know I'm talking fast, but I got a lot of slides to get through, so apologize. Okay, so the spring crop plan, it's so take a look at this. This is kind of like my go-to on, okay, how, like when I'm planting my crops, like this is kind of a table that I like to think about, or yeah, let's just get into it. All right, so the winter-killed cover crops, something like oat, peas, and radish, they're going to die in February. And since they're dead in February, that's a good time to plant like spinach in March, or onions or peas. If I'm planting more in April, I might tarp that bed in March and then pull it off and plant those greens in April. And actually on my beds right now, several like the oats beds are actually tarped, and I'm going to be pulling them off in like a week or whenever I'm ready to plant spinach. So a closer look, that's winter-killed cover crops. That's them dead at the bottom. Check the chat real quick, make sure it's not lagging badly anymore. Awesome. Okay, that makes me more comfortable. I got a message. Okay, so on the left, you've got, winter-killed cover crop. You can see like if you planted it earlier, those oats are going to get bigger and you're going to get more biomass. But at any rate, you can see on the right, I usually just rake that cover crop off in the spring to get the bed planted, show you a couple options here. Okay, yeah, so that's a picture of oats, dead oats. You can see cereal rye in the foreground and like cereal rye in the back. Like, can't really seed lettuce into that. So that's why we're choosing something that winter kills in the middle two beds. So those are dead. Just rake them off. that's and then I put compost on this particular bed just to kind of help fill out the bed and delineate the edges again, and just give it some little bit of organic matter and to help kind of create like a seed bed in a sense. I'm not really, disturbing that soil that much at all. Sometimes I do a little raking if it needs it, but this year it was just a light layer of compost and ready to go. So in a bed like that, I'll usually put like 3 rows of lettuce or 3 rows of spinach down that 30-inch wide bed, or 4 rows of onions. So there's an example of lettuce. If there is a lot of residue, like in your transplanting, I'm not sure it's worth raking it off, because you've got, I guess an option would be not to rake it off. Just leave, if you're transplanting, you could leave that residue on the bed and transplant right into it. If you don't want to rake it off, like it gets a little bit, like I've done this before, like I've left the oats or the dead cover crop on and tried to like seed in little furrows or even like broadcast. And it can work. I'm not sure it's like 100% germination and 100% like clean rows like you could get by raking it off. But yeah, if you're a market farmer and like you're trying to make a living off of this, like maybe not. But something like peas that are like on the bottom right that are a larger seed, those seem to push through that mulch just fine. So because a lot of people would straw their peas anyway, so they come right up out of an oats mix. There's a seeding. There's onions. Okay, here's a weed. Okay, so yeah, it's not always perfect, right? Oats might, or the Winterkilled cover crop might not give you 100% weed suppression, and that's where I think that tarp comes in helpful. So that's a bed of oats that was tarped in March and pulled off, and then would just rake those beds and be ready to plant. This was actually a picture yesterday. That's the oats under the tarp, pulled off the tarp. There was some weeds, so because I'm planting, like I didn't get it tarped in time, like it's only been tarped for 2 weeks, so those weeds are turning yellow, but they're not quite dead. But since I don't want to wait another 2 weeks to plant spinach, might do it next week. I wanted to, I'm not sure it's going to kill all those weeds, so I basically just had to go in and weed, and it really wasn't too bad. I know that's bed dependent, but it took me it didn't take long to go through that bed and pull out like any of the nasty perennials and things that I thought would give me a problem. And then I put a light layer of compost on. There's a couple more beds. Oats in the middle in the walkways, the residue, and the roots are left behind, right? Decomposing. And I'm actually putting that tarp back on that bed until I need it, which hopefully in a week, and then I'll pull off and plant some spinach. Okay, let me check time. Okay, I think we're doing okay. Okay, so going into that was dead cover crops, right? Winter-killed cover crops. So let's go into overwintering low biomass is what I'm calling it. What a word. So biomass is just just like a mass of biology, I guess. No, just like residue, right? Like root mass, like how big's this crop getting? So I've got kind of broken down between overwintering low biomass and overwintering high biomass. You'll see in the overwintering low biomass, like I say, oats, I put oats in there. The oats are going to die and the legumes are going to live. But I like this mix because, it doesn't have cereal rye in it, but it's just, it's producing a lot of nitrogen. And kale likes nitrogen, corn likes nitrogen. So, and it's a little bit easier to kill early without a tarp than it is if you had cereal rye in it. And I want to plant my kale early. So that's kind of why I choose to leave that cereal rye out of that mix when I'm going to kale. So I'll just dive into the example so I can kind of better show that in pictures. So this is oats legume cover crop. You can see it growing. You can see like on the top right picture, the crimson clover is flowering and the hairy vetch isn't yet. That kind of goes back to like, just like the life cycles of these cover crops. Hairy vetch might bloom in May or late May. Clover might bloom in late April or like mid-March. So it's kind of like there's a range there, right? And if you were just trying to mow this cover crop at flower without any other extra measures of killing it, like a tarp or extra mulch, then if you were to mow that picture on the top right, or cut it, or weeded it, or sickle it down, or even use a hedge trimmer or shears, at any rate, you cut that thing, the crimson clover might die because it was at flower, right time, but that hairy vetch hasn't even started flowering yet. So it's going to have vigor to want to regrow. And I think that's why there's extra measures like mulch or like tarps are really helpful in trying to kill these things. Okay. Yeah, I just wanted to show you a picture of what hairy vetch does look like at flower. And there's hairy vetch and crimson clover aren't the only cover crops. They're not the only legumes, but I just wanted to kind of break it down to, I chose a few, the ones that I most commonly use to talk about today. So I told you about kale, right? I used this before kale. So that's crimson clover growing on the bed in the spring. I weeded it down, top right picture. And then I like to put a layer of newspaper on top of it and a layer of straw. And I've tried it without newspaper and the crimson clover regrew, sorry. I've tried it with newspaper and straw, the combination, and it held it down a whole lot more. I leave it strawed and mulched up like this for at least 10 days before opening transplant holes, because transplant holes will let that sunlight in and allow that cover crop to regrow. So it just helps to keep it the occultation going, right? The eclipse, the blocking out the sunlight. So you can open up transplant holes quicker, but yeah, just be ready to weed a little bit more. It's kind of a balance. And you know, if you really think that cover crop might come back, then I guess just do this a little bit earlier and tarp and tarp for a couple. Or you could tarp, pull off the tarp, and then mulch. There's lots of options here. So that's transplanted kale into that bed. Kale likes nitrogen. It's kind of what I was alluding to earlier. The hairy vetch and the crimson clover are giving us nitrogen. I do like to wait until it's kind of a balance. Again, like I like to wait and let these legumes grow as much as possible, because the more they push towards flower, the more nitrogen they're actually producing through nitrogen fixing bacteria. However, it's a balance. If I want to plant my kale on April 20th, then I'm not going to let the cover crop grow so much. I'm going to try to kill it, you know, at least 10 days before that. That's yeah, I'm probably not going to dwell on this too much, but you know, I really like this chart that kind of helped me think through, okay, is this cover crop going to give me nitrogen, or is it taking away nitrogen, or is it balanced? So you can kind of see that, you know, when the date of termination on the bottom, so March 1st, if you kill it, it's kind of like nil. There's not much nitrogen production. The cereal rye is like really small, so it hasn't really tied up a whole bunch of carbon or become very carbon rich yet. And then when you talk about like June, right, like the legume has gone to like full potential of producing nitrogen. The cereal rye has gotten big, and it's more carbon rich. And so, yeah, and then like a legume grass mix is kind of more in the balance. So I kind of think through this, like, you know, if I do kill that legume on in the middle of April, at least I'm getting some nitrogen, but I'm really like, it's nitrogen, but you know, this cover crop's also for just biology and just keeping root exudates flowing into the soil. So there's a lot more reasons to plant cover crops other than just producing nitrogen, but it's also a great reason too. Okay, so that's hairy vetch cut at flower. On the left, I think that's before flower, so I think I'll put some extra mulch on top of that before planting. On the right, this was a lady that I work with that just want to show, I guess I put this slide in here to say that a low biomass cover crop, in my definition of it in this presentation, doesn't necessarily mean that it's not going to give you a bunch of mulch or a bunch of biomass. It's just a little bit easier to work with because it doesn't have cereal rye in it in the terms of like cutting. So she actually pulled the hairy vetch off because it was kind of moist that morning. So she wanted it to dry, so she windrowed the hairy vetch and then put it back on our beds later. I like it with corn, again, because it does do nitrogen. So I'm not planting, you know, kale I plant in April, so I got to kill these legumes early, but corn I'm planting in May. So I can let that legume grow more towards flower, produce more nitrogen, and then like cut it and then tarp it. If I think there's a lot of weed pressure, definitely tarp it. yeah, it just helps. It just helps to cut that. It just helps to tarp before doing the crop, just to make sure everything's dead. I guess I will mention that like for the last yeah, for the first like 5 years of trying this, like I wasn't using tarps, so you can get it to work. It just kind of changed my life when I started adding them into this rotation. I'm just able to produce more food because I can get things killed more efficiently. It's just helpful. So if you do add cereal rye into one of these biomass mixes, it becomes a high residue biomass pretty quickly. In April, it's it's going to start growing fast. If you mow it early, so that's cereal rye on the left, that's the perfect time to cut or crimp it because it's at anthesis. It's like dripping pollen on it off of it, but it's not quite started to make hard seed or seed. So if you were to cut it earlier than that, you can see on the right, that's a picture of beans with cereal rye regrowth around it. So that's not what you want. You want so cutting cereal rye, I think, is a little bit tricky. You can do it though, like especially if it's at full, if it's at that stage and then the legumes are at that same stage too. Like this is an example of cutting it down. The bottom left, I don't think there was any extra mulch received, and then the tomato was planted right into that, and it was great weed suppression. This is a small bed, so any weeds that were popping up are easily picked. It's not necessarily a large acreage that you have to super be concerned about any regrowth or weeds popping up through that mulch, and it worked. But in general, my kind of go-to strategy on killing a high biomass mix is to crimp it, and that's to just flatten it over. So this is cereal rye, hairy vetch, and crimson clover. That crimping, I think I mentioned this, but it's better on grasses than legumes. So I would expect that some of that hairy vetch kind of regrows through that mat, and maybe even the crimson clover. But so yeah, you might get some regrowth, or it might just continue, not necessarily regrowth, just continued growth. Whereas the cereal rye might die, but that's not what you want either, right? So again, I'll go back to the tarp or extra mulch, and I'll show you some examples. So this is kind of the back to the crop plan. So using an overwintering high biomass mix, so cereal rye and legumes, like I just showed you. And I use those before things like things like tomatoes, like transplanted tomatoes, peppers. I use them before seeding green beans and squash. You could transplant it as well. And you'll notice that in April, so if, let's say I'm planting tomatoes May 15th, I just back up 4 weeks, 3 to 4 weeks with the tarp. So I'm going to crimp that cover crop April 15th, tarp it, and then pull it off May 15th and plant. Maybe pull it off a couple days, kind of depending on moisture, but pull it off a couple days before planting, just to let, maybe there might be some like gases that just kind of let it air out, I guess. And then just make it kind of stabilize the environment a little bit with the air, and then plant the crop. So yeah, tomatoes, peppers, green beans, squash. And you can see that that very bottom row, that squash that's planted in June, that second, I usually do like a second planting of squash and maybe green beans. So I'm letting that cover crop grow even further into its maturity, because I don't need to kill it yet. So if I'm planting June 15th, then I'll back it up to May 15th and tarp it. Okay, so that's what a tarp looks like over cereal rye. That's probably 2 weeks in. You can see it's yellowing on the left. You can kind of, I guess in that picture on the right, there's crops growing, and that would have been like a winter-killed cover crop. But yeah, the one that's having the tarp pulled off is cereal rye and probably some legumes. On the right, that's after 4 weeks, and it's dead. It's brown. So you can either seed into that or transplant and mulch up. And when I say seed, I'm not necessarily talking about like lettuce. And although like I don't think a lot of folks would like try planting lettuce in that. I have, and it works. And I think I might again. I guess it maybe not best practice, right? Like in general, like small seeds don't come out of like mulch like that. Like I wouldn't plant carrots into that, but I guess I have had luck with some like spinach. But in general, like when I'm talking about seeding into these mixes, usually more bigger seeds like beans, and I think squash works good too. So it's hard to get a like a row seeder through there, or even make a furrow. Like I've tried making furrows. I've made furrows with a pointed hoe through this rye, but it's really hard and it's really messy. So I don't think I'd recommend that. It's tough. You can do it, but yeah, it's a little tricky. So I like to just kind of, I just like to take my trowel, and I know it's a little bit time consuming, but it saves me time for weeding later. If I did make a furrow, it kind of disturbs the soil, and weed seeds germinate, and I get like a weed flush in my planting row. So doing it this route, I get the bean, into the soil, and it's really minimal disturbance, and yeah, it works. So on the bottom right though, like another option would be to transplant into a mix like this. Okay, that's squash on the left, seeded. That's squash on the right, seeded. So you can kind of see the cereal rye still hanging out under there, even a month or two after that crop's up and producing fruit. That's the beans on the left, and then the beans on the right. I can see a couple grasses in those beans on the right. Like weed pressure was not bad though. Like I think I went through there and just kind of pulled the grasses before they started making seed. But one thing that's kind of helpful, I guess I'll draw your attention to, is these 30-inch or 4-foot beds, or just having like that bed system with the walkways. It is, yeah, I guess in the beds, like in a 30-inch bed, like I can plant 2 rows of beans, and it just seems, or 3 rows or 4 rows of something. It seems like the way urban farmers are growing their crops, like it's very dense. And I think that's helps tremendously in this kind of system, just to start beating the weeds. If it was just 1 row of beans, like you might get more weed pressure. So just a thought to consider. Yeah, speaking of weeds, the cover crop's not going to get them all, right? Like again, like even if it's 95%, you still got weeds that you got to deal with. So I pick them or pull them, or if the bed's like ridiculously full of weeds in the spring, then I might consider tarping early, just like, like weeding it down, or yeah, just tarping early just to make sure that these weeds aren't going to seed. But I don't like to do that. I don't like to tarp early if I don't have to, like super early, right? Earlier than I want to, because I want the cover crop to reach more of its potential. So it does involve some weeding, yeah, just to keep the beds clean. So yeah, you might have a cover crop bed, but just expect there to be some weeds, not always, but some. So yeah, that's kind of back to the crop plan. I just wanted to show this one more time, just so you can get a visual on kind of looking at it holistically. But winter-killed cover crops before March and April plantings of like small seeded stuff like leafy greens and onions and peas, or I usually use a low biomass mix before things like kale and corn, and then a high biomass mix like rye and legumes before May transplanted stuff, or green beans and squash, and those are terminated by tarps. There's some good resources. These are really, really cool books. Jesse Frost at no-tillgrowers.com has also a lot of like online content, as does several of these other folks. Brian, I just watched a video from our training at like an organic conference from Brian O'Hara that was really good. So all these books have some certain value. I guess maybe to draw your attention to, let's see, Brian FYI, Brian O'Hara's book, he's got some good stuff about solarization using clear plastic. Charles Dowding does a lot of no-dig gardening, so that's no-dig gardening, but he uses a lot of like compost, like kind of mulching up with compost. Ben Hartman's an Indiana farm. Elliot Coleman kind of developed a lot of these techniques. He uses a tilther a lot on his ground, as does Jean-Martin Fortier, so kind of like a power harrow or a tilther to kind of incorporate the top inch of soil. Daniel Mays does it without a tilther, but using a lot of leaf compost. And then Jesse Frost kind of trials out a lot of different kinds of stuff. So definitely recommend checking out any of these books. And of course, Managing Cover Crops Profitably, and Crop Rotation on Organic Farms from Sayre. Both those books are free and online. Sorry, the book's not free. The online PDF is free, but yeah, it's good to have a couple of copies around. And support and resources. So I guess I'd encourage you to reach out to your SWCDs, urbansoilhealth.org. as well. The Indiana Association of Soil and Water Conservation Districts has a program to just help and assist growers and just figure out the best way forward for soil health. And then so local SWCDs, your NRCS or Purdue Extension. So with that, I think I'll thank you. And if anyone has any questions, I'd be glad to try to entertain them.
Thank you, Kevin. That was very good. I have a quick question for you. Where do you source your cover crop seeds from? Where are you buying them at? I get that question a lot. On the farm, I'm buying them by the 1,000 pounds. So I can get them a lot easier. How about you?
So I've not everybody's here is in Indianapolis, right? So you might have like a co-op or like even like the people the folks that do like a co-op or seed, like big seed companies that do sell to big farmers. Like sometimes those co-ops will break seed down into bags for you. Like let's say, okay, I want 2 pounds of rye. They might be able to do that. But if it was like 2 pounds of some obscure cover crop, like they might not want to bust open a 50-pound bag to do that. So it's kind of like, it's kind of hard to just go somewhere and like the box stores usually don't have them. Some garden stores do, but usually I get them online. So to answer your question, I get them online. So wherever you order your vegetable seeds from, so usually the shipping is what hurts, right? So if you can combine that in your order with your vegetable seed, if your vegetable seed company offers cover crops too, just go ahead and plan out your cover crops early and order them with your vegetable seeds. So places like Johnny's Seeds has them. I think Peaceful Valley Organics has them. Green Cover Seed is one that's easy to use because they sell in increments of like 1 pound bags and 5 pound bags and 10 pound bags. And they have a wide diversity, and they also have like seeds with varieties stated, so you know what variety they are. You know that it's like, if it was a variety if there wasn't a variety stated, like one might bloom, it might be a mix of different variations of that species. So some rye might bloom early or grow bigger, and it's just to have something uniform is kind of helpful. So that's a good place to it's easy to use. Yep.
Yeah, variety not stated, VNS is sometimes that's okay. It's a little bit less expensive, but sometimes you're paying the cost because of different stages of it.
Yeah.
We have a question here in the chat from Laura. Do you need to rotate cover crops just like you do regular crops? For example, if you planted rye as a cover crop one year, do you need to make sure you don't plant rye again the next year in the same place?
Good question. I don't worry about it. Well, that's not true. Okay, let me rephrase that. Okay, so radishes are one that I keep my eye on because like a winter-killed mix of like oats and field peas and radish is awesome. But if I'm going to be planting or if I have planted another brassica in that bed, like kale, or like in the last couple of years, or if I'm going to be planting kale there next year, or broccoli there next year, I won't put a radish in that mix. So yes, keep your eye on things like that. I think radishes, because of like black rot and things, so I do take that out of the mix a lot. I wish I had more information just right in front of me, but like hairy vetch, it probably have planted repeatedly in one spot. Like you could potentially, I can't remember what the disease is, but you could potentially cause a disease to a certain crop. But I think what I would recommend is check like that cover crop on Rotation Organic Farms. It's the one that's free and online, but it's got a chart in the back that says, okay, if you plant this crop this year, whether it be a cover crop or a vegetable crop, if you plant that this year, then, and if you plant, let's say, a different crop next year, what are the benefits of doing that, or what are the drawbacks? So it really goes into, so if I plant cereal rye, like, can I plant, does it work well with beans? Or so that's kind of helpful in thinking through like red flags. But good question.
I know on my farm, if I have a great cover crop that I'm planting into, and then the rest of the year I have corn, soybeans, whatever on there, that is a rotation away from crop ready on a lot of things. You can get a rotation just from your cover crop to your regular crop to your cover crop again. So.
Yeah. So yeah, I guess in short, like I haven't worried about to the extreme where I would think like, okay, last year I planted a high biomass mix of cereal rye and vetch on this bed. Like I wouldn't be afraid to do that again this year on that bed after vegetables this summer.
Marissa has another question in here. I'm thinking of using sorghum Sudan grass in an urban plot front yard garden. I don't want it to get too tall.
Yeah.
You know, good plants so I can get good growth, but not crazy. Also want to make sure it winter kills.
Yeah, sorghum Sudan grass. I'm gonna share my screen one more time. If you don't mind.
Oh no, go ahead.
Okay. That's sorghum Sudan grass. Can you see that? It gets real tall, right? It will winter kill. Like so the seed that I just bought from Green Cover Seed was a sterile variety, so it's actually not going to produce seed. I have done this before and it got real tall and it started producing seed, and it like that's probably not great for your garden potentially. So sterile kind is available, but you can see like on the foreground, like I've chopped it for mulch, and then it's going to start regrowing during the summer. So it can like regrow if you chop it for mulch. But yes, eventually it winter kills. So that's dead sorghum. And I guess like, yeah, I didn't add sorghum to this talk because I didn't think there was enough time to cover it. But I guess let me get my thoughts around this. So yeah, if you do that cutting for mulch, like on a growing bed, and it regrows, the very bottom of it becomes really stiff and like rigid, just the way the plant acts. So I guess I wanted to draw your attention to that like actually weed eating through that, or trying to plant small seeded stuff into a dead like is a little bit difficult, even if you rake it off, just because there's so much root and it's a high biomass cover crop. It's kind of like cereal rye, except it dies during the wintertime. So yeah, just getting through that's tough, but I have transplanted into that in the spring. So like lettuce, like I could have transplanted lettuce right into that. I think that answered your question. That's the lettuce coming up through. Like it was hard to plant that, but it did work. It was just hard to do. So you can like if you in the summertime, like that's not sorghum Sudan grass, but that's a summer cover crop. There it is. You can see on the left that's sorghum Sudan grass that's been weed eated. I think my preference would actually be to crimp it over with my foot instead of weed eating it because of what I just kind of talked about. But if you weed eat it and not let it regrow, then you don't really get that that stalky effect. And you know how to stop it from regrowing, right? You put a tarp on it. So that's yeah. So like that might be weed eated. Put a tarp on it. There's the sorghum Sudan grass and sun hemp in that middle row. The sun hemp's like got the yellow flower. And then yeah, so that was actually after the tarping. Pulled off the tarp off the sorghum Sudan grass and planted lettuce into it, transplanted lettuce, and it did just fine. So I hope I answered that question. Yes, it does winter kill.
Yeah, as you're sourcing, there's a plant sorghum, there's a plant of Sudan grass, and then there's a hybrid sorghum Sudan grass. So we're talking 3 different species. Some of them are a little shorter. The sorghum or the Sudan grass will grow a little bit shorter maybe than the sorghum, but it always works. Anybody else have other questions? You're welcome to unmute and ask them direct if you like.
I couldn't have explained it that well that there's no questions.
When I talk to people more on the farming side, try to get them to start slowly, introduce species more, just a few at a time, and learn how to handle them. And like you're saying with the heavy roots, if people want something to look nice, sunflowers are a great mix, a great cover crop that we don't have in our soil. Every plant type introduces a new type of bacteria in your soil biology. So something that'll winter nicely. There's a lot of species that have hollow stems. Sunflowers is one of them. Rapeseed, some of the other things. So the hollow stems are a lot easier to handle in the spring than the thick masses, like red clover or some of them other ones. So.
Yep. Yeah, and I should mention too, like red, you know, though I showed a table which I'm going to put a link to in the chat as requested. There you go. Yeah, I think I mentioned that annual legumes, you can mow them at flower or cut them at flower and it terminates them. I guess I have to see, be careful with red clover, because red clover is more of a, I don't know if it's a biennial or like almost like a short-lived perennial. So if you cut it at flower, it still might want to come back. I've seen the mistake made of trying to kill that just like you would crimson clover, by cutting it. Of course, you could tarp it, maybe, and kill it, but yeah, just cutting red clover is a little bit tricky.
And unless possibly you want a full year growth of a crop, that's going to really add to the soil. Red clover, a lot of these will, if they can grow through the year. You know, if you want to dedicate a plot to using tarps and or flail mowers or other chopping tools, small scale, in order to use a larger diversity of cover crops in a mix. Share your evolution of thought process and get more diversity and good kill.
Hey, I'm going to read that as well. Can you talk a little bit about that? So. Yeah. Yeah, I guess, okay, so let's roll back for 3 years when I was trying to do this without tarps. If I was going to be planting like a legume mix to kill it with cutting, like let's say I'm going to cut this legume mix, like oats and crimson clover, and I was going to put some straw on it, a little bit of straw to try to hold it down, and then transplant into it tomatoes. I wouldn't have put hairy vetch into that. I wouldn't have put ryegrass or cereal rye into it, because I needed that one species to be flowering at the right time. I needed that simplicity. I didn't need 4 or 5 cover crops, like one going to seed, one not even close to being blooming. So nothing at the right stage. And sometimes the universe works out, and and a lot of times actually it's kind of incredible how many times like it does work that they're all flowering at the same time, but sometimes it doesn't. So I would just choose like one species and that I know how to control, that I know when to cut. And now that like using tarps, I can throw the books at it, like just to have that, like I can put multiple species. You could put 5 or 6 or 10, and just the more diversity that you have with cover crops, the more biology that you're stimulating, just different types of root penetration, like one's breaking up compaction, one's like creating tilth, one's attracting mycorrhizae fungi, like the oats, for example. The radish might be breaking up compaction. The cereal rye's just got tons of fibrous roots. Yeah, so all sorts of superpowers that these individual cover crops have. So the more you can plant in a diverse mix, the better, I think the better it is for your soil. Granted, it's unfortunate that you got to just kill them at some point in time. But yeah, gives you great benefit. And you can always plant them again.
Can you see the question?
Yeah. Yeah, well, yeah, I was going to finish Ellie's question too, maybe, or flail mowers or other chopping tools on a small scale. Yeah, like I think like if you had a flail mower, like a really good, like a flail mower is like one of those ones that gets on the BCS. I know that's a little bit bigger scale than gardens, but the better that it chops it up, like you can more effectively kill something like cereal rye with mowing, just because it chops it up so well. Whereas like a weed eater, like sometimes it doesn't, and it's hard to get low, like towards the growing point of these, of like cereal rye. So you might get more regrowth. So yeah, if you have a better machine, then or just like a more powerful machine that can chop these things up a little bit more and get a solid kill. Yeah, I think that maybe answered your question, Ellie. Let me look at the chat. Yeah, Cheryl said that I planted radish and turnip as a cover crop and they all winter killed. Is there anything else I need to do before planting? So I guess I'd ask the question like, is there weeds? So like get the chickweed out before it goes to flower, like take the, that's when I do take the roots out, like just dandelions, just make sure it's yeah, weed free. Yeah, and then just I rake that off and seed, or rake it off and or leave the residue on and transplant spring vegetables. A little layer, as I was showing earlier, a little layer of compost does help. It just like there's some soil disturbance sometimes in seeding, and I just think that when you're disturbing soil, if you've got organic matter being disturbed into the soil, it's better for the soil. So I think that light layer of compost is just like kind of just makes things smoother. Yeah, and if the weeds are too bad, like again, tarp. I've got a tarp on my 2 oats beds right now, my 2 Winterkilled beds right now. They're prepped. I prepped them already because yeah, just to be ready to go. And then I'll pull off the tarp in a week or 2 and plant. And I was like, let me think that through just a little bit out loud. But as far as the timing on like tarping a Winterkilled mix or prepping the bed for vegetables, like if that bed was like hard and I needed it seems like over time, like over time, soil health is going to increase if you stick to this kind of no-till, cover crop heavy, compost, like have intensive gardening system. Soil health will improve, and that seed bed's gonna be it's gonna make itself over time. Like after 5 years of this, like the seed bed's just more fluffy, and it's got better tilth. It's more easily planted into. But first starting out, you might have like hard, compact soil. So it might take a rake to kind of form a seed bed, just like hitting fluffing up the soil with a rake. So I might potentially do that before putting the tarp on that Winterkilled bed in the spring. So like I would rake the oats off now and maybe form a seed bed and then put the tarp back on. And the reason I would do that is just to kind of hopefully stimulate weed seeds in that soil. And so they germinate under the tarp and die, as opposed to tarping and then pulling off the tarp and then raking that seed bed and then stimulating the seeds then when you're planting your crop. So you're gonna, no matter what, you're gonna have some like weeding to do in between lettuce rows. Of course, it's these systems, like especially the Winterkilled cover crop, where doesn't leave a whole lot of residue on the ground. Like it's not gonna stop weeds all season, right? You're gonna have to go in there and like hoe in the middle of the rows, or use like a linear hoe to kind of clean that up, or hand weed, or if you can, like put enough mulch or compost like on that it just blocks out the weeds. That's another option. But expect to have to do something in those rows. Hope that helped kind of think through that. If you need to like fertilize, like I'm just top, like if the bed needs nitrogen, if it's going to kale or something, like I'll just top dress the bed with like feather meal or blood meal on just right on top of the bed. So that might be another step in preparing the bed for your crop.
Do you notice any increase in pest pressure that are overwintering in the debris from winter-killed cover crops?
I'm not a pest expert. I don't close my eyes to it because you can't. No, I haven't noticed like, I was gonna say I'm not a pest expert, but like, no, I've not noticed. Like I know there's instances that it'll happen. Like you read about like, okay, does straw help? Like, yeah, look up like Google sometime like the straw harbor pest, and then type this straw harbor like beneficial insects, and both searches will get you great stuff, leaning one way or the other. So yeah, my hope is that this system as a whole like increases beneficial insect life in the soil, and that our predators and good insects kind of outbalance the bad stuff. So no, I haven't necessarily seen an increase. Like it seems, yeah, like compared to like my neighbor plots in my community garden, like it seems like my disease pressure is, it's not, definitely not more than theirs.
Thank you, Kevin. I'm going to ask Joelle to share a little bit about the urban and small farms program that's happening now. Can you say something?
For sure. You won't be able to see me because I'm using Mike's audio, but I'm Joelle Neff. I'm with the Allen County Soil and Water Conservation District. I know a few of you, and I hope to get to know quite a few more of you if you're making some contact. But we have a program for urban and small farmers, educating just like this, talking about cover crops, other soil health practices. So we'd love to connect with you. I put our phone number in the chat. So if you want to give us a call, we may be contacting you soon to just get to know you by coming to see your site. And if you have any questions, we'd love to answer those. And if you're not in our project area, which our project area is Adams County, Allen County, Steuben, Wells, parts of Noble, and DeKalb. I hope I didn't miss anything, but even if you're not in those counties, give us a call and we will connect you with.
Good. I want to talk about our next coffee. It's going to be coffee and soil testing on March 19th, 2022. It's going to be with James Wolf, Ag and Natural Resources Educator, Purdue Extension, and he's going to talk about taking and interpreting soil tests. So that'll be an interesting one. One thing that I'd really love to go on, Kevin talked briefly about gases, off-gassing. There's a whole nother subject of biofumigants that you can do, the mustards and a few other plants. So that might be an interesting one too sometime. Thank you, Kevin. Any parting words? Do you want to? It was great today. You covered a lot of broad subjects that pertinent.
Yeah. No final words really. Just thank you all, and good luck with your cover crops, and yeah, happy planting.
I'll put some good resources in the chat on your website and the things, so everybody's welcome to look at them again. This will be available again at our website, the Allen County SWCD at gmail.com. So once it gets put on, it'll be available. So thank you everybody for joining. Great questions, good time. So are we ready? We'll end it here, and thanks again.
Thanks everyone.